The wind whispered through the sprawling valleys of Wyoming, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. At Lone Pine Ranch, the early morning light spread golden fingers across the rugged terrain, a tranquil scene masking the tension that simmered beneath its surface. Eleanor Hayes adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon as her boots crunched softly on the frost-kissed grass. To anyone watching, she was a rancher's wife, going about her morning chores, as unassuming as the land she loved. But Eleanor was no ordinary rancher's wife. The sound of distant engines broke the morning stillness, a faint, low growl that sent a shiver of unease through the still air. She spotted the source, 2 motorcycles prowling along the dirt road just beyond the property line. They slowed but didn't stop, their riders barely visible behind mirrored visors. It wasn't the first time Eleanor had noticed them, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Inside the modest ranch house, her husband Henry was already at the kitchen table, his weathered hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee. His brow furrowed as Eleanor walked in, setting her gloves on the counter. "They're back," he said simply, not looking up from the local news on his tablet. Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements measured and deliberate. "Same as yesterday?" 2 riders. Same patches, iron reapers. She took a slow sip, her mind already calculating. The Iron Reapers weren't just bikers, they were a growing force in the region, their reputation forged in violence and intimidation. The sight of their patches in this quiet corner of Wyoming wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. "They're testing us," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "Patterns, response times. They're waiting to see how we react." Henry met her gaze, a flicker of worry in his usually steady eyes. "What do we do, Ellie?" Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We wait. Let them think they've got the upper hand." Outside, the rumble of engines faded into the distance, but Eleanor knew the game had just begun. Shadows were circling the ranch, predators closing in. What they didn't know was that they weren't the only hunters. Eleanor had spent years in the shadows, and now she would use them to her advantage. The afternoon sun hung low over Lone Pine Ranch, casting long shadows that crept across the rugged landscape. Eleanor Hayes stood near the barn, her hands busy mending a fence while her mind turned over the morning's events. The Iron Reapers were escalating, their moves becoming bolder with each passing day. She felt their presence like a storm gathering at the edges of her world. Henry emerged from the house, his expression tight. He held a folded letter in his hand, its edges smudged with grease and dust. "This was left on the porch," he said, handing it to her. Eleanor unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the jagged handwriting. 2 days to reconsider. Sell, or there'll be consequences. No signature, just a crude drawing of a reaper holding a scythe. She held the paper in her hands for a moment before folding it neatly and tucking it into her jacket. "They're not just testing us anymore," Henry said, his voice low. "They're making their move." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the reapers had last been seen. "That means they're getting desperate." "Good. Desperate men make mistakes." Inside the house, she went to the old cedar chest that sat at the foot of their bed. From it, she pulled a worn leather case. Inside was a disassembled handgun, its parts gleaming faintly in the dim light. Methodically, Eleanor pieced it together, her fingers moving with a precision born of long-forgotten training. As she loaded the magazine, Henry appeared in the doorway, his worry plain. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, his voice heavy. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes steady. "We don't have a choice. They think they can scare us, Henry. They think I'm just some rancher's wife." She clicked the magazine into place. "It's time they learned what happens when they underestimate me." That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, Eleanor stood on the porch, her stance casual, but her eyes sharp. She felt the weight of her weapon concealed at her side. A familiar companion. The distant sound of motorcycles echoed through the quiet air, growing louder with each passing moment. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't move. Instead, she waited, a silent predator standing in the shadows. By the time the Reapers rolled onto the driveway, their engines roaring like threats, Eleanor was ready. They thought they were stalking prey, but they were about to find themselves caught in the web of a master hunter. The motorcycles roared into the gravel driveway, their lights cutting harsh beams across the gathering dusk. Eleanor Hayes stepped off the porch, her boots crunching softly as she moved to meet them. Her stance was casual, hands loose at her sides, but her eyes stayed fixed on the leader, a tall man with a predatory grin. He dismounted first, removing his helmet to reveal sharp features and a scar that bisected one eyebrow. "You must be Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "Or should I say Eleanor?" Eleanor tilted her head, feigning unease. "You've got the wrong place, mister. My husband handles all the ranch business." The man chuckled, stepping closer, his enforcers flanking him like loyal wolves. "See, I don't think I do. My friends call me Razor, but I don't think we're friends, yet. I'm here to make you an offer." She folded her arms, playing the part of the cautious rancher's wife. "I've already told your men we're not selling." Razor's grin widened, his eyes narrowing as he closed the gap between them. "It's not a matter of if, Mrs. Hayes. It's a matter of when. And let me tell you, when can go a lot smoother if you just sign the papers." He pulled a folded contract from his leather jacket, offering it like a poisoned chalice. Eleanor didn't take it. Instead, she allowed her shoulders to slump slightly, as if the weight of the situation was finally pressing down on her. I'll talk to Henry about it," she said, her voice shaky. Razor's grin turned smug, misreading her hesitation. "Smart choice. You've got until tomorrow evening." He turned to leave, motioning for his men to follow. As they mounted their bikes and rode off, Eleanor stood on the gravel drive, watching their taillights vanish into the darkness. The trembling in her hands stilled, replaced by a calm efficiency as she turned and walked back into the house. Henry was waiting for her in the kitchen, his face etched with worry. "What now?" Eleanor reached under the counter and pulled out a secure satellite phone she hadn't touched in years. "Now, we remind them why people fear the name Ghost." She dialed a number she knew by heart. When the line connected, a familiar voice answered, low and steady. "This is Marshal Cole." "It's Eleanor," she said. "I need a favor." There was a pause before he replied. "I was wondering when you'd call. Tell me what you need." Eleanor glanced toward the door, the sound of distant engines still echoing in her ears. "I've got shadows circling, Marcus, and it's time I taught them who the real predator is." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the satellite phone resting between her hands as she outlined her plan to Marshal Marcus Cole. His voice was steady on the other end of the line, a reminder of the years they'd spent working together before she left that world behind. "The Iron Reapers aren't just a gang," she said. "They're running something bigger. Smuggling routes, stolen tech, maybe more. I've seen their patterns before." "Sounds like we're looking at another shadow network," Marcus replied. "You sure about this? Once you step back in, there's no halfway." Eleanor glanced at Henry, who was quietly sharpening an old hunting knife at the counter. His silent support steadied her resolve. "I'm sure. This isn't just about the ranch. It's about stopping them before they grow too big to contain." "Understood. I'll mobilize a team and send you some eyes in the sky. You've got backup this time." "Good," she said, the edge in her voice unmistakable, "because they're not ready for what's coming." By midnight, Eleanor was in the barn, assembling her gear. Hidden compartments in hay bales and false floorboards revealed an arsenal she hadn't touched in years. Tactical maps of the area were spread across a wooden table, the details of the Reaper's suspected routes marked in red. "Still fits," Henry said. leaning in the doorway as she adjusted a tactical vest. She smirked, sliding a pistol into its holster. Muscle memory never fades. Just don't get too used to it, he said, his voice tinged with concern. You said you'd leave this life behind. She crossed the room and kissed his cheek. I did. But sometimes, the past doesn't let you stay retired. 2 hours later, Eleanor crouched in the shadows of a ridge overlooking the Reaper's compound, a sprawling maze of warehouses, trailers, and parked motorcycles. Her earpiece crackled as Marcus's voice came through. Drones are overhead. We've got visuals on their movement patterns. Sending data to your tablet now. Eleanor studied the live feed, her sharp eyes tracing the lines of activity. Guards patrolled in pairs, their routes methodical but predictable. Trucks loaded with crates marked only with vague shipping codes came and went, their drivers taking orders from men in patched vests. This isn't just weapons, Eleanor murmured. Look at the shipments, secure packaging too professional for a gang. This is military-grade tech. Confirmed, Marcus said. Cross-referencing serial numbers now. Stand by. Eleanor adjusted her position, her gaze locked on the compound's central office. The lights were still on, and she could see Razor pacing inside, speaking to someone on a burner phone. Time to rattle their cage, she said. Careful, Ghost, Marcus warned. We've only just begun unraveling this web. Eleanor smiled grimly. I know, but sometimes you've got to set the spider running to see how big its web really is. As the drone feed tracked her movements, Eleanor crept closer to the compound, her steps silent, her focus razor-sharp. It was time to pull the strings and watch the shadows burn. The quiet hum of night settled over the Iron Reaper's compound, punctuated by the occasional murmur of conversation and the low rumble of a generator. Eleanor Hayes moved like a shadow through the tall grass beyond the fence, her breathing steady, her movements precise. The compound was alive with activity, but it wasn't the careless bravado of an ordinary biker gang. Men moved with practiced discipline, patrolling in pairs, their weapons held like they knew how to use them. Trucks loaded with nondescript crates idled near the warehouses, their contents a mystery, but Eleanor had her suspicions. Drones confirmed 24 personnel. Marcus's voice came through her earpiece. You've got high ground overwatch on the south ridge and a blind spot by the west gate. Copy that, Eleanor whispered. I'll use the west entry. Her tablet vibrated as the feed updated. She studied the highlighted patrol routes, noting the rhythm of their movements. Timing was everything. Inside the compound, Razor paced the central office, barking orders into his burner phone. His frustration was evident, his movements sharp and agitated. I don't care what it takes, he growled. That ranch is the last piece we need. Get it done. One of his lieutenants leaned against the doorframe, his expression uneasy. What about the shipment? We've got people asking questions about the delays. Razor slammed the phone onto the desk. The shipment moves tonight, no matter what. If anyone gets in our way, we bury them. The lieutenant nodded but hesitated. Boss, the Hayes woman, something about her feels off. Razor shot him a glare. She's just a rancher's wife. Keep your focus where it belongs. Outside, in the darkened yard, Eleanor listened through a concealed parabolic mic. Razor's words confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just about her ranch. It was about something much larger. Using the Westgate blind spot, Eleanor slipped into the compound, her movements silent as she darted between stacks of crates and rusted vehicles. She reached the side of the central warehouse, where the faint hum of a generator masked her steps. Overwatch sees you, Marcus said in her ear. You've got 2 patrols moving toward your position. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her pistol drawn. She waited for the first pair to come into view. They were casual, chatting in low voices, their flashlights sweeping lazily across the ground. In one swift motion, she stepped out, striking the first man with the butt of her weapon before sweeping the second off balance. Both were unconscious before they could make a sound. West gate clear, she whispered. Good work, Marcus replied. But you've got a problem. Razor just doubled security around the office. Looks like he's getting nervous. Then let's give him a reason to be. Inside the central warehouse, Eleanor discovered what she'd been looking for. Stacks of crates marked with codes that matched known military suppliers. She pried one open with a crowbar, revealing rows of high-tech surveillance equipment. Marcus, I've got confirmation. This isn't just smuggling. This is stolen government tech. They're running an entire black market operation. Copy that, Marcus said. I'm mobilizing the extraction team, but you'll need to hold the compound until we arrive. Eleanor closed the crate, her jaw tightening. Don't worry, I'll keep them busy. As she exited the warehouse, Razor's voice blared over the compound's loudspeakers. To the intruder, you've got guts walking into my territory, but you won't be walking out. Eleanor smirked, stepping into the open just enough to draw attention. She fired a single round into the air, the sound echoing across the yard. You've got it backward, Razor, she called out, her voice cold and steady. This isn't your territory anymore. It's mine. The compound erupted into chaos as the Iron Reapers scrambled to respond, their movements frantic. Eleanor faded back into the shadows, ready to dismantle their empire piece by piece. The reckoning had begun. The compound was a storm of chaos. Razor's men scrambled to form defensive positions, their shouts punctuated by the distant hum of drones overhead. Eleanor Hayes moved like smoke through the confusion, her every step calculated, her every action deliberate. Razor's locked himself in the office. Marcus's voice crackled in her earpiece. But his lieutenants are rallying near the eastern warehouse. You'll need to break their command structure before the team arrives. On it, Eleanor replied, her voice steady. Near the eastern warehouse, Razor's lieutenants barked orders, trying to bring order to their panicked men. Eleanor slipped into position, hidden behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. From her vantage point, she could see 3 of Razor's top men gathered near a truck loaded with crates. Shipment needs to move now, one of them growled. Forget the intruder. We've got buyers waiting. The second lieutenant shook his head. Razor wants this handled. Nobody moves until the rancher is dealt with. Eleanor smirked, her fingers brushing the detonator in her pocket. She had planted small charges around the truck earlier, and now the time had come to deliver a message. She pressed the button. The explosion wasn't large, just enough to disable the truck and scatter the men. Flames licked at the edges of the crates, casting flickering shadows across the panicked faces of the lieutenants. Before they could regroup, Eleanor stepped into the open, her pistol raised. Game's over, gentlemen, she said, her voice cold. One of them reached for his weapon, but Eleanor's shot was faster. The bullet struck the ground at his feet, forcing him to freeze. I wouldn't, she warned, her tone calm but lethal. The second lieutenant snarled, his hands raised. You don't know who you're messing with, lady. Eleanor tilted her head, her expression sharp. That's where you're wrong. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A gang that thinks it can hide behind fear and stolen power. But that ends tonight. As the remaining men hesitated, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Razor's reinforcements? No. Eleanor recognized the disciplined hum of federal transport engines. Backup's here, Marcus confirmed in her ear. Time to finish this. The federal team swept through the compound with precision, securing key positions and detaining Razor's men. Eleanor remained on the move, her sights set on the central office. Razor was waiting. Inside, the office was a fortress of makeshift defenses, barricaded doors, overturned furniture. Razor stood in the center, his pistol drawn, his face a mask of fury. You've caused me enough trouble, Hayes, he spat. I don't care who you think you are. Eleanor stepped through the door, her weapon steady. I'm the one who ends this. Razor fired first, his bullet striking the doorframe as Eleanor darted to the side. Her return shot shattered a desk lamp, the sharp crash echoing in the confined space. They circled each other, the room thick with tension. Razor lunged, trying to close the distance, but Eleanor sidestepped, delivering a sharp strike that sent his pistol skittering across the floor. He stumbled, reaching for a hidden blade, but Eleanor was faster. Her boot pinned his hand to the ground, the knife clattering away. "You never stood a chance," she said, her voice low and unrelenting. Razor glared up at her, his breath ragged. "You don't understand what you're messing with. The Reapers are just the beginning. You can't stop what's coming." Eleanor crouched down, meeting his gaze. "You're right, but I can stop you." Behind her, federal agents entered, their weapons drawn. Razor was cuffed and dragged to his feet, his reign of terror finally over. Outside, the compound was secured, the federal team cataloging the evidence of the Reapers' operations, military-grade technology, stolen goods, and a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Wyoming. Marcus approached Eleanor, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You did it. Took down the whole operation." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon where dawn was breaking. "This was just one piece of a larger puzzle, but it's a start." As the first rays of sunlight bathed the compound, the shadows that had once hidden the Iron Reapers' empire burned away, leaving nothing but the stark truth in their wake. Eleanor stood amidst the wreckage, knowing the fight was far from over. The game had changed, and the next battle was already on the horizon. The sun rose high over Lone Pine Ranch, casting warm light over the rolling hills and the now quiet compound where the Iron Reapers' empire had fallen. Federal transports had long since rolled away, carrying Razor and his men to face justice. Eleanor Hayes stood on her porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand, gazing out at the land she had fought to protect. Inside, the house was buzzing with activity. Marcus Cole sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open, surrounded by stacks of files and tablets streaming live feeds from federal agencies across the country. 4 more arrests tied to Razor's operation, Marcus said, looking up. "Your intel's unraveling their entire network, arms deals, smuggling routes, even connections to foreign buyers." Eleanor nodded, her expression calm but focused. "They always think they're untouchable, hiding behind shadows, but shadows don't last in the light." Henry walked in, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he set down a plate of sandwiches. "You should have seen her," he said to Marcus. "Calm as a Sunday morning, taking down that entire gang like it was nothing." Marcus chuckled. "I believe it. The ghost never loses her edge." Eleanor sipped her coffee, her thoughts already moving ahead. This was just one cell, a piece of something bigger. The stolen tech Razor was moving. Someone else is pulling those strings. Marcus nodded, his face growing serious. "We're seeing the same patterns that tied into the El Paso case. High-level players, international connections. If Razor's part of that network, they'll come looking to clean up." "Let them come," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "We're ready this time." Later that evening, as the sky turned hues of orange and purple, Eleanor stood at the edge of the pasture watching the horses graze. Henry joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Next? There's always a next, Henry. But for now, we rebuild. We let the land heal. We let us heal." His grip tightened slightly. "You've done enough, Ellie. You've earned a quiet life." She looked up at him, her eyes soft but resolute. "I'll always want that, Henry. But some battles don't end. Not really. There's always more shadows to burn away." As the stars emerged in the Wyoming sky, a familiar hum broke the silence. Marcus stepped out of the house, a tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to see this." Eleanor took the tablet, scanning the report. Arrests were rolling in across the country. Corrupt officials, hidden caches of smuggled goods, and sleeper cells tied to Razor's network. It was a cascade of justice, each revelation pulling another thread in the tangled web. "You started this," Marcus said. "Without your groundwork, none of it would have come to light." Eleanor handed the tablet back, her expression unreadable. "The work's not mine alone. It never was. I just gave it a spark. The fire belongs to everyone who believed the truth was worth fighting for." The night settled over Lone Pine Ranch, serene and still. But Eleanor knew peace was fleeting. The Iron Reapers were gone, but the corruption they served lingered in unseen corners. As she stepped inside the house, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was an encrypted message from one of Marcus's contacts. "Activity spotted. Unusual shipments moving through Montana. Coordinates attached." She stared at the screen for a long moment, then smiled softly. The ghost wasn't done. She might have returned to the ranch, but she would always keep watch. Shadows had learned to fear her, and the light she carried would continue to burn away darkness wherever it dared to rise. Eleanor poured herself another cup of coffee, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The fight was never truly over. But she was ready for whatever came next. Always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.